Welcome to Adobe Photoshop. Today we're going to be learning the basics about Photoshop, how to create images, select elements within the image, create layers, and manipulate them within your design. So we're going to get started in Photoshop by clicking on a new file. When you come into new file, it's important to understand in Photoshop you have to tell it what size of image you want to create. So you have a choice of determining the height and the width in different measurements. Generally, when we're working in a photograph, we're thinking about it in terms of pixels. If we have something in mind that we want to print, we might be thinking about it in a measurement like inches or centimeters. In terms of resolution, that's how many pixels we have per inch, and we all know that the higher the resolution, the better quality the image, but also the larger the file size. So there's two numbers to remember when you're thinking about resolution. You have 72 pixels per inch, which is designed for looking at an image on the screen, and 300 pixels per inch if you're going to put something in to print, and it can be larger than that. So if you go over to photo and you see that you have like a 5x7 photograph, you have it already set here to inches, 7 inches wide by 5 inches tall, in a landscape orientation at a resolution of 300 pixels per inch. If you go over to print, you can see a letter size that you would print on, and you have all these other ones that are in here. So for today's practice, we can just start with this default Photoshop size, this 5x7, and leaving the background color to be white, and hit create. And that's the image that we're going to be working on in here. Let's talk about the areas of the screen that you have in Photoshop. On the left-hand side, you have your toolbox with your set of tools. There's a little double arrow up at the top. If you click on the double arrow, you'll see those in 2 rows, which sometimes helps because you see that you have the foreground and background colors are a little bit bigger there, and it's a little bit easier. This is a little bit more of a traditional layout that you can see. Across the top, you have a toolbar that will change based on what tool you have selected. So as I choose different tools within the toolbox, you can see that that toolbar is going to change. I can access tools here by using my mouse to click on them, or there are hotkeys on your keyboard. For example, if I want to go to the paint bucket, that's G. If I want to go to the mover tool, which is the first one I had at the top here, that's V. Paintbrush is B. You can be learning some of those as you're going along here. I'm going to go back to V to my mover tool. Okay, across on the right-hand side, you see various panels that are in here, and you can resize those panels as you need. We're going to be working with layers today, so you might want to make the layers panel a little bit bigger, and you can resize how much space you have for the panels as well. Okay? So one of the biggest part of using Photoshop is learning how to work with layers. So when you worked in Illustrator, you could simply draw objects on the screen, and each of those objects you could manipulate separately. That is not the case for Photoshop. In Photoshop, the #1 rule is when you want to when you want to manipulate a shape, you need to have that shape be drawn in a separate layer. So that's the first thing that we're going to work on today. You're going to notice it starts with a layer called background that is locked. We generally, in Photoshop, when we're building an image, you're not going to put anything in the background layer. Now, if you open a photograph, it'll come in as that background layer. But the different objects that you have on your screen that you want to manipulate need to be in their own layer. So we're going to begin by clicking on, down here in the bottom of your screen, the little plus sign that says Create New Layer, just right next to the garbage can. And you're going to see that comes in, and the preview, this little thumbnail here, has gray and white rectangles on here, so it's like a checkerboard, and that represents clear. So essentially what we've done is lay a clear sort of sheet or drawing area on top of our image. You can't see any difference because it's clear, but that's what we've done. So if we double click where it says Layer 2, I'm going to call this layer rectangle. Now you might think, well, do I need to rename every layer? It's not required, but the more layers you get, the better it will be for you to keep them organized and give them names. So I'm going to go to the marquee tool now, which is the first selection tool that we're going to learn. And I can do that by clicking on the marquee tool or pressing M on my keyboard. And then with that tool, I'm going to click and drag to make a rectangle. It doesn't really make a difference the size. And what you see is a selection on your screen. So it looks like little dancing ants going around the outside, or marching ants that you have going around there, that shows you that you have something selected. With that done, I'm going to go to the paint bucket tool. Now sometimes the paint bucket tool is not visible and you might see the gradient tool. So anytime any of these tools have a little triangle in the bottom, that means there are other tools that are hidden beneath them, and you can fly out that tool by pressing down on your mouse button and holding, and you can see I have different tools hidden within there. And you can see that underneath all of these tools that you have different tools buried inside there. So I'm going to press and hold on that if it was the gradient tool, and I'm going to change it to the paint bucket tool. At the bottom of my toolbox, you have two boxes of color. If you're starting your program for the first time, they might be black and white. Okay. The first one, the one that's on top, is your foreground tool, and behind it is your background tool, or your background color. So when you go to the foreground color, you can double click on it, and you will bring up the color picker. The color picker has this slider that you can go from different types of color, and then you can pick your color within this box here. Okay, I'm going to choose a blue type color, so I'll choose that slider, and I'll go all the way to the corner and grab that. There are different color numbers that are associated with your colors, and you've got a couple different color spaces here represented. Hue, saturation, and brightness. RGB is what your screen is, red, green, blue, and then CMYK is what your printer uses, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And then there are color numbers down here at the bottom. So that's fine for now. I'll click OK, and with my paint bucket, I'm going to click inside of my selection, and it's going to turn it into a filled-in rectangle. Notice that you can see the rectangle in the thumbnail over in my layers panel. I'm going to teach you a couple keyboard shortcuts as you go along. The first one is to deselect. So Control D on your keyboard will deselect, and you no longer have those little marching ants, that selection. I'm going to grab my mover tool again by either clicking on the toolbox or pressing V, and you'll notice I can move that. If you cannot move your rectangle, then you drew that rectangle on your background, and you need to press Control Z to undo and to go back and make sure you have the rectangle layer that you created selected before you draw that. So the number one rule is, if you want something to be manipulated separately in Photoshop, it needs to be in its own layer. If I want to change this, you'll notice I don't have any way to change my rectangle. If I want to change, let's say it's size or rotation, I can hit Control T, and that stands for transform. I can then scale it up and down. I can rotate it around, and I can also click on the middle of it and move it. I can get all of those transform tools. And then to keep that, I can press enter. If I press enter, it'll keep that. If I press escape, it'll take it back. It'll forget my transform. So again, Control T to transform, and then press enter to commit that. Is some of the basic ways that you can manipulate an object once you have it in its own layer. So the next step is we're going to make another object. We're going to make a circle. So back down to our new layer button in our layers panel. Click on new layer, and we're going to call this layer circle. And now I'm going to go to the marquee tool and press and hold on that and grab the elliptical marquee. Now if I select with the elliptical marquee, that's what I get as an ellipse. If I press and hold on the shift key as I drag, it'll keep that as a circle and it combine that selection. So let me hit Control D to deselect. I'm going to hold down shift. It's going to constrain my height and my width so I have a circle. Double click on my foreground color, and I'm going to choose a red color and fill that with red. Oops, Control Z, paint bucket, fill that with red. Now Control D to deselect, grab my mover tool, and now I'm moving that around. And notice, to select my rectangle, I click on the rectangle layer and move it around. And to select my circle, I get the circle layer. Notice that layer switches. However, notice that my rectangle tool, or excuse me, my rectangle drawing is always on top. And that is because that is the order that these layers are inside of my layers panel. If I click on the rectangle layer and drag it up, now my rectangle's on top. So the order that my layers appear over in the layers panel are the order that my layers will appear within here. Now I wanted to show you something within here. You can also not only control the order of your layers, but you can control the opacity. On each layer you have this opacity percentage, and opacity refers to how visible those pixels are. So for example, 0 is clear like a window, and 100% is solid like a wall. But we can go, if you've ever heard of a window being opaque, it's somewhere in between. And notice how my color mixes. I have the red and the blue going together, and I get a purple color. If I want to make that bigger, Control T, scale that up, and you can see what that looks like. Okay, so it's allowing that color to go through, and that's an interesting way to kind of combine or blend your objects together, is with that opacity. Okay, so that's a basic start to working in here. We have our marquee tool. Now there's certainly some other ways that you can select. You have the lasso tool, which has a few different options. You also have the magic wand tool, which has some other items in there as well. Okay, so let's go now into another tool that you're going to want to use within your toolbox, and that is the type tool. So let's go down and find the type tool. It's the capital T. Okay, you're going to kind of notice that these tools in your toolbox are grouped together. This type tool, this arrow pointer, and this shape tool are all borrowed from Illustrator. So when you're familiar with making vectors in Illustrator, you can use these, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But they don't quite work they work the same way, but the result is a little bit different. But let's click on the type tool here, and what I like to do is not click and drag, but simply click. And when I do that, I'm going to get a cursor. So you have a font. Your font's probably going to be different than one. It's going to remember the last font that I used. I'm going to grab a font that's pretty bold. I'm going to grab Impact by pressing I on my keyboard here and getting down to Impact. Let's go. There we go. All right, and I can choose a color here. I'm going to choose like a gray color, and there's my text. It says lorem ipsum, which is just kind of like a nonsense word. I'm going to type in my name, Mr. Peacock. Okay, now my mover tool. I can hit Control T, and I can scale this up. Look at the power that we have here. And I can go back to my type tool and click on it, and I can click and I can type within that. I can also select it to change the font, centering, any of those things that you're used to doing. Notice how my font had changed. Let me go back to that. Notice how my font had changed to some weird number because to get to that. So if I say, well, I'd like it to be a regular number, let's just choose 48. And you can see that, okay? So that's a good place to start. I think one other thing I'd like to show you is the layer effects. So if you go down to the bottom of your layers panel, there's this little FX for effects. And if you click on that, you're going to see a list of effects. Really easy to add. So I'm going to add onto here a stroke. And I can choose a color for my stroke. White is fine. You can change the size, all sorts of things that you can do. You can add a drop shadow here. Let's add a drop shadow. Okay, I like that. Gradient overlay. And I can choose the colors that are in there. Choose. Okay, and this is a point right now where you really just need to maybe play around with some of these different effects so you can start getting used to those. But it's a fun way to add some flair to what you're doing. So that's day one of Photoshop, which is learning how to use these different layers, how to manipulate them by transforming them, changing the opacity, adding different effects, and then you're ready to kind of move on to the next step of selecting maybe parts of an image or other things that you want to impact. Good luck and have fun.